Okay. So our first speaker is Andrew Olendzki, and I'd like to introduce him to you. He's a professor and director of the Mindfulness Studies program at Lesley University. He's a scholar of early Buddhist thought and practice with a special interest in Buddhist psychology and its relevance to the modern world. Working with both Sanskrit and Pali materials, he explores how the contemplative arts of India and Asia can be understood scientifically, and how the contemporary interest in mindfulness and deeper health can be best informed by the wisdom of ancient tradition. Prior to joining Lesley, he worked for almost 30 years in Bar, Mass., first as the original executive director of the Insight Meditation Society, and then as executive director and senior scholar at the Bar Center for Buddhist Studies, where his focus was always upon the integration of academic study with the practice of meditation. During this time, he also held recurring adjunct faculty positions at many New England colleges, including Amherst, Brandeis, and Harvard, Smith, and Lesley. He was on the faculty at Wesleyan University and Hampshire College. Andrew was also a senior scholar at the Mind and Life Institute, contributing to their Mapping the Mind project, and has been a longtime board member of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy. Some of his prominent publications, I've read this book by you, Andrew, Untangling Self, a Buddhist investigation of who we really are. And I also read Unlimiting Mind, the radically experiential psychology of Buddhism. In 2017, Andrew published Older and Wiser, Classical Buddhist Teachings on Aging, Sickness, and Death, and numerous book chapters on mindfulness and Buddhism and contemporary mindfulness movement. I'm really happy to have Andrew speaking to us. Please give him a warm welcome. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Professor, for that introduction. I cannot see anybody, so maybe you could just describe to me, if I were there, what would I be seeing? Do we have a handful of students?
Can we open up the screen for him to see?
It didn't work.
I don't need to direct you.
Yeah. So it's an auditorium, and we've got about 30 students in here and some faculty, but there's probably other people online who are watching it too.
All right, that's good enough. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
And I'm sorry you can't see it, because I know it could be disorienting if you can't see it, but anyway.
No, that's all right. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share some thoughts with you today on sort of the structure of the mind and body, mostly the mind, especially where it relates to mindfulness, the quality of equanimity, and how that relates to compassion and self-compassion. And I have a slide that I'm going to try to share with you. And it looks like we're off to a good start here. Yes. So Buddhist psychology is an empirical science. It's much like our science in the West, but in that it is empirical. It observes what's going on and then describes a system based on those observations. The difference is in Western sciences, our civilization is largely outward looking. We're looking out at the world. So when we want to investigate the mind and understand ourselves as human beings, we tend to study other people's minds. We study other people, either historically through talking to them and having them report their experience, more recently by looking into their brains with scanners and so forth. But in ancient India, in the time of the Buddha, which is where this material originates, meditation was the primary tool for the empirical investigation of experience. And so people would sit down under a tree, usually out in nature, usually cross their legs and put their back straight because that facilitates stability, and observe. Now, the main thing that one sees, and we can do this today, of course, is that one gets direct connection, experience with this quality of consciousness. We don't really know still what consciousness is, basically. There's a lot of approaches to it. It hasn't really even been studied scientifically in our culture until the last 40 or 50 years. You know, before that, it wasn't considered a valid topic of scientific investigation. By consciousness, I'm trying to find a term that's as broad as possible. We don't have a lot of words for it in English. It's basically awareness, being aware of something, knowing something. But it's not so much the content as the process of knowing. It is the fundamental coin of the human realm, if you will. It's the fundamental capacity we have as humans. And meditation is simply a matter of observing firsthand what is the nature, the texture, the process of consciousness. What does it feel like to be aware, so to speak? Now, one of the first things that one notices in this enterprise is that consciousness is embodied. You know, we are doing this in the context of a physical body. And the two are not something entirely different from one another. They have vastly different qualities and textures and features, but they are fundamentally an interdependent process. Consciousness is something that is accessible to creatures that have a body, in our case, a complex biological organism that supports a brain. And this body, this really material world, is itself embedded in a much larger empirically observed material world. That is to say, the body is part of a larger environment. In classical Indian thought, this environment is thought to be characterized by the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water, which is just a simple way of relating to matter, referring to matter as a whole. Today, we might call it solid, liquid, gas, and heat. And basically, the four great elements and the forms derived from the four great elements. They understood that these basic forms of matter combine with one another in various complex combinations to give rise to experience. Most directly, when we're talking about observed human empirical experience, we recognize that consciousness arises in interdependence with the organs of the body. We have these five sense organs: the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. And the Buddhists add a sixth one, the mind. We would call it the brain, but there's a physical substrate to all of our capacities to know. And that substrate are these organs. And each of our organs has evolved in its environment to be sensitive to a certain range of information, a certain band of input of information that comes in through what they call the sense doors. So the eye is sensitive to visual forms. The ear discerns sounds. The nose smells or odors. The body sensations, the physical touches. The tongue is susceptible to taste. And the brain or the mind is taking in the information of thoughts. These thoughts are more internally generated, where the other is external information, but it's still the same dynamic. There's this fundamental interdependence of the senses, the sense objects, the sense organs, and the knowing of that information. So mind and body are fundamentally interdependent. Now, in ancient India, as much as today, there were materialists that said mind is an offshoot of the body, that it's really all about substance, and then the epiphenomena of mind comes up. And in the ancient world, as today, there are those that put it the other way around, that consciousness or soul is sacred, transcendent, and materiality is kind of an offshoot of that. But in early Buddhist thought, at least, these two, mind and body, mentality and materiality, were seen as fundamentally interdependent with one another. Now, consciousness was more complex than this. It also arises with the capacity to experience feeling tone. I use the word tone here because the English word for feeling is ambiguous. It can mean our emotions, or it can mean the sensation. The Buddhists understand it as simply the feeling tone of pleasure or pain, whether something feels good or feels bad. Or in the middle of those two extremes, there's a neutral or a feeling tone that isn't easily discernible as pleasant or painful, but there's still the sensation there. Also co-arising with a consciousness is the faculty of perception. They use this word a little bit different than we do in Western psychology. It's not just the senses, but perception is that entire capacity of the mind, of the brain, to cognize information. It uses language, it uses stories, it uses narrative, it uses concepts, it uses ideas and images to construct a kind of world of cognitive understanding. It creates stories about what is being seen and what is being heard and what is being felt and so forth. Consciousness itself, as we first use the terms, simply knowing or awareness, doesn't really carry any information, like a mirror, one of the images they use in the classical texts. It simply reflects whatever comes in front of it. It's these other apparatus of the mind, the perception and the feeling, which adds texture and flavor and complexity and interest to what it is, interpretive value of what it is that consciousness is seeing or knowing or being aware of. And it's perception where all the thinking takes place. The mind and the mind objects. These mind objects are largely thoughts. This is where we think in images, we think in concepts, we think in language. And in Western thought, Western psychology, certainly among folk psychology, many people think that this is really just what the mind does. It thinks thoughts. And it doesn't appreciate the extent to which the Buddhist meditative tradition does. How much of our mental activity is simply knowing, simply being aware, especially since it's coming through the 5 sense doors. If you think about it, and if you explore it in your own experience, you'll notice that you're only capable of experiencing what's in the present moment when you use any of the 5 senses. The seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, that's all real-time, immediate information coming in. It's only the mind door that's able to think about things, which include things in the past and things in the future. And this, of course, can cause us a lot of difficulty. A lot of people think too much about the past or think too much about the future and worry about it and so forth. So the thinking mind is one aspect of what the human mind and body can do. But in classical Buddhist thinking, it's a relatively small aspect, whereas in our contemporary world, it looms so large that many of us think that's all we're capable of doing. So a lot of mindfulness practice, a lot of contemplative practice has to do with sort of getting out of the head and into the body, into the senses, into the raw information that's coming through the sense doors without being mediated by a lot of storyline, a lot of interpretation, a lot of judgment. Now, this isn't the whole story. Those are 4 components, but there's a 5th component, which is, we'll call it intention. This word in Pali and Sanskrit, sankhara, is very difficult to translate, but it's that sort of volitional, intentional, decisive, acting component. The perception and feeling and consciousness are all answering the question, what is going on here? That's an apple falling from the tree, whatever. This 5th aggregate, as it's called, 5th component of the mind, intention, has to do with how do we respond to what's happening? How do we act? How do we engage with our experience? The others are more passive. This is more intentional and interactive. One way to understand this intention is it's got these three different components. In modern language, we can say it has to do with states, that is, emotional states and mental states. A state is what is it that's arising in the mind in this present moment? We might say in the vernacular, what is his state of mind? This is where the emotions come in, not with the feeling tone, but with the intention. Emotion is a form of intention. A person is feeling agitated, they're feeling benevolent, they're feeling friendly, they're feeling afraid, they're feeling angry. That's the state of mind that they're in. And, where the mind and the emotions leave off and join one another is a little bit nebulous, so we call them mental and emotional states. What is the quality of the mind in the present moment? And based on that, we take action. We're always doing something. The three forms of action in classical Buddhist thought are mind, speech, and body. So we're either doing something with our hands and feet and so forth, or we're saying something either out loud or in our head, or even thinking. Every moment of thought is a kind of mental action. Every moment we are in some sort of response to this mental state or this emotional state. If we're fearful, we're going to think and do and say things in a certain way. If we're feeling friendly, we'll do so in a different way. Now, here's the interesting thing about Buddhist psychology. These actions that we undertake, even the mental actions that aren't apparent, lead to the development of certain traits, certain dispositions, certain underlying tendency, certain habits of mind and behavior and speech and so forth. That is, we learn through our actions how to be a certain person. So if we're angry a lot and we act out that anger by being violent or hurtful in our speech, we are training or practicing to become a slightly more angry person. And then these underlying tendencies that we have, which are largely unconscious, then influence what traits come up in the present moment, in the present mind. You notice on the diagram, these three are in a circular relationship because they're constantly shaping and reshaping one another. This is the real heart of our personality, of our character. It's a series of traits, underlying habits of mind and body that have been gradually built up over a lifetime, however long or short that is at this point, of experience. Experience is a continuing interaction between how are we think and feel in the moment, how that influences what we do in the world, and how what we do in the world shapes who we are as a person. You may have heard a lot about the Buddhist teachings about non-self or no self. They're basically saying that it's not that we don't exist, it's that we exist as a bundle of dispositions, of character traits that have been gradually shaped over time. And then, this is important, can be reshaped by present experience. In other words, who you are in the moment has been shaped by all of your past experience, who you were in the past. But how you're experiencing the present moment is going to shape who you are next and how your character and personality manifests in the next moment, in the next hours, in the next days, and so forth. For the Buddhists, of course, they go back beyond birth and death as the extremes when they bring in rebirth. But that's not an important part of this model. So altogether, these are called the five aggregates: consciousness, feeling, perception, materiality, and intention. These are five aspects of the mind, five functions of the mind that are fundamentally interdependent, interconnected, interacting. All five of them come up together every moment. And in the classical Buddhist model of mind, mental experience is something that is episodic, a state of mind. All these things congeal around a certain sensory input and then collapse, and then congeal again around the next moment's experience and collapse. And so this is another part of the Buddhist teaching on impermanence and on self. It's not that we don't exist, it's that we exist as a kind of flashing contingent phenomena that's constantly being shaped and reshaped by all kinds of factors. So it's all really existing, but it's existing in a very contingent, episodic, transient, and malleable way. Just, surprise, surprise, like everything else in nature, you know? You see the human being as a natural part of the natural world. Now, these factors in experience are universal. They're always happening every mind moment. Now, there's a number of other factors. This is drawing upon an Abhidharma model, which is sort of more developed Buddhist psychology, that it says that there are another 6 factors, we don't have to get into all of them, that are occasionally there. Sometimes they're present and some are not. And among these factors are sort of this deliberate intention and sustained attention. We have the ability in our mind to put our senses and our attention, our awareness, our consciousness on a particular object that we choose. You know, if we want to look across at that tree, we can. And if we want to hold our attention on that tree, we have a factor that can do that. Of course, the mind tends to wander off. And so a lot of meditation has to do with exercising these 2 mental factors, putting the mind where you want it, let's say on the breath, and then holding it there so that when it drifts off, which it inevitably will, you bring it back onto the breath or the chosen object of meditation, hold it there with sustained attention until it drifts off, and so forth. So all of this is what we would call using the mind consciously, you know, deliberate, decisive, intentional experience. And we can use other factors among these 6, like decision, to actually make decisions. We can act, not necessarily out of fear or anger or lust, but just act because this is the appropriate thing to do. So this is one way that conscious experience can be cultivated and used to guide one's spiritual development as well as just get through the world. But as we know from modern psychology, and the Buddhists were well aware of this, we also have a whole range of unconscious processes. This is really the realm of the character traits or personality traits. These are habitual behaviors. When we do something over and over, like, you know, learn to play the piano or type on the typewriter or, you know, ride a bicycle or whatever, we train the body and mind to do certain things in a habitual way, you know, and we can do that consciously for a while, but at a certain point, we sort of let it go back into the background, so to speak. In modern neuroscience, there's a lot of talk these days about the default mode network. That is, there's certain ways the brain operates when we're at rest and not doing anything specific. And then that is bypassed or overridden by certain prefrontal apparatus in the brain, which are brought to bear when we're doing things deliberately in a sustained, decisive way. In classical Buddhist thought, of course, this is where they talk a lot about karma, you know. Again, karma, not so much about what happens between lifetimes, but karma within a lifetime, you know. The person you are now is the result of cause and effect over your lifetime so far, you know. So if you've been traumatized when you were young, that's going to have an effect on who you are in the moment. You know, if you've been, you know, loved and supported in the past, that's going to affect who you are. So karma as the consequence of action. And of course, this also emphasizes how we're laying down behaviors for the future. And I think there's a lot to be said here scientifically about genetic influences as a form of karma, perhaps seen somewhat differently. Now, so this model of mind so far is saying there's certain mental factors that are always happening, the 5 aggregates, primary among them. There are actually 7, but we don't need to get into the detail. Then there are some factors that are occasionally present and occasionally not, but these are still all ethically neutral. What happens next is there are a total of 14 mental factors in one version of the Abhidharma that really would be considered unwholesome or unhealthy or unhelpful or unskillful. These are 4 ways of translating the same word, akusala, in Pali. And it's not to say that it's bad or it's evil. It's not an ethical judgment. It's a practical judgment, you know. There are roots in our psyche as human beings that have evolved over millennia, over ages, that give us the tools we need to survive in the wild, in the world. Primary among these, and some of these are unhealthy or unhelpful and to the development of a spiritual life, and others that we'll get to in a moment are healthy or helpful. In terms of the unhealthy ones, the 3 roots of the unhealthy behaviors are greed, hatred, and delusion. The Buddhists talk a lot about these. Greed and hatred are just fundamental urges that we have deeply embedded in our psyche. The greed is, I got to get what I want, get what I need. It makes sure that we eat when we're hungry and drink when we're thirsty. And if somebody gets in our way, so what? It's a selfishness. I need to get what I need to survive at any cost. The hatred is the opposite of that. It's more the impulse to be willing and able to, fight against or destroy or run away from anything you don't like, you don't want, anything that's threatening. It gives us the power to fight for our lives if we have to, and at any cost to the other. It gives us the power to run like hell to get away from whatever is chasing us. And these 2 fundamental impulses, greed and hatred, and there's a host of synonymous terms for these, those are the harshest, are fundamental aspects of human nature. It's deep in our genetics. Probably all animals have it, and to different degrees. And it can function often to shape our actions, to shape our states of mind, and our underlying as traits in our psyche that has an effect on things. Altogether are 14. I won't mention the others, but recognize that there's that these unhealthy states are going on. Now, if we're trying to practice meditation, we're using our deliberate and sustained intention to keep our mind on the breath and be aware of what's going on, like this guy in the present moment. Notice, you may have noticed if you tried this, a good deal of what you're going to be aware of are these unhealthy or unhelpful things, self-criticism intruding, or annoyance about somebody making noise behind you, or jealousy of somebody who has something you don't, or restlessness just kind of spinning out, and so forth and so on. A lot of Buddhist meditation is about learning to deal skillfully with unskillful content, unskillful processes in the mind. And that brings up the next sort of a complex of mental factors that come up together, primarily around mindfulness. Mindfulness is a way of being aware, a way of being aware that is fundamentally in between greed and hatred. It's fundamentally manifesting this co-arising quality called equanimity. Equanimity, based on a word for being equal or there in the middle, in balance, is neither favoring nor opposing, neither wanting something that you really are greedy for or having aversion towards or not liking or not wanting something that you hate or that annoys you, you know. Mindfulness is a way of being aware where you're there in the present moment. And you're simply observing what's happening empirically without wanting it to be something different, without trying to change it, without trying to alter it in some way, you know? So what we're seeing here is a kind of layered or textured approach to the contemplative life, as seen in this early Buddhist system. We are aware, as we can see from the screen circle, at all times. It's not about learning how to be aware. We're always aware. The question is, with what quality will that awareness? The awareness is shaped by perception and feeling. The awareness is also shaped by a whole range of intentional states. That awareness can be shaped by fear. It could be shaped by trust and love. It could be shaped by whatever. So we're always aware. Sometimes we're deliberately aware. That's when we feel like we're meditating. We're learning to practice meditation. But much of that time when we're practicing meditation, what we're actually experiencing is what Jon Kabat-Zinn in his classic definition of mindfulness called judging, you know, being aware in the present moment, non-judgmentally is mindfulness. Most of the time we're in the moment being aware of the mind judgmentally, not necessarily value judgment, but just, I like this, I don't like this, I'm glad this is happening, I wish that wasn't happening, I want that to happen that's not, and so forth and so on. So we may be meditating when we're using the mind intentionally, but we're experiencing a lot of unhelpful experience. And we may be highly aware of that unhealthy experience, even with deliberate and sustained intention. But according to this model of the cultivation of traits and states and actions, that's really not going to help us get out of it. If anything, it's going to strengthen it. If we spend too much time thinking about how annoyed we are, we're just going to get more annoyed. And if we do it with a deliberate intention, it might even exacerbate the situation. So what we're really striving for or aiming towards with contemplative practice is what I would call true mindfulness. Mindfulness kicks in when we are aware of some object of the senses with an attitude of equanimity, with a quality of mind of non-attachment. And two of the factors that come up along with mindfulness, along with the equanimity, is what they call non-greed and non-hatred. We have other synonyms for this. Non-greed includes things like generosity. That's why giving is always helpful in Buddhist psychology, because you're cultivating that quality of non-greed. When you give something of value to you to someone else, you're relinquishing your hold on it. Yeah, it's a moment of equanimity in the act of generosity. But there's also non-hatred. That is, for the moment, we're not averse. We're not wishing that something wasn't there. We're not, we're accepting it. This, another word for this in the, that we may be familiar with is, oh, my controls aren't working. Here we go. A synonym for non-hatred is loving kindness. This is the word for metta. And many of you know this is another way of cultivating meditative experience, not loving kindness. Loving kindness is just an attitude, an emotional state of benevolence, of caring, of friendliness. It's not love as we know it in English, because that's a multivalent word, but it's loving in the sense of being friendly, of being affectionate, of being benevolent, of kindness. And basically, it's a form of not hating, non-hatred. Now, loving kindness is universal. You have kindness for all beings, and all the texts are teaching us how to expand the natural kindness we have for our loved ones and our family and expand the range, the boundary of that farther and farther. So it includes, people that we don't know that well, or people even that give us difficulty, all creatures in the world, not just humans, can we feel benevolent, friendly kindness to anybody and everybody? And then that loving kindness morphs into gladness or sympathetic joy when we see someone else who's having good fortune or healthy experience or whatever. We feel kindly benevolent. We feel happy for them. I'm glad that you won the lottery. I'm glad that you are having good fortune. And I got to keep moving this around because I don't want to block myself. And it morphs into compassion when we see suffering. When we see another person in hardship and difficulty and suffering, that's when the universal kindness turns into compassion. Compassion is a different category of mental factor, as is gladness. And it means that you want, technically, it's the trembling of the heart in the experience of seeing another person suffer. So compassion is a response of wanting to help, wanting to alleviate the pain, wanting that person to be well. May you be well. May you be safe from harm. So that brings up some interesting thoughts. I'm running out of time, so I can't go through all of them. But self-compassion is an interesting modern practice. It's becoming more and more popular, but it's not something taught in the earliest texts by the Buddha. We don't see self-compassion come in until almost 1,000 years later in Buddhaghosa's commentary on these Buddhist texts, where he talks about compassion for oneself. In the early texts, it's all about sending the compassion outward to others. And then at a certain point, it's like, well, how do we learn how to do that? And Buddhaghosa says, well, everybody naturally loves themselves. So we just, based on that, learn how to expand it to others. Now, fast forward to modern psychology and to modern practice in the meditation centers of all this. And it turns out that we don't all naturally love ourselves. In fact, our culture has a lot of self-hatred, a lot of self-criticism, a lot of self judgment. And, so the practice of self-compassion is evolving as a very helpful tool for healing. But I think it's healing more in the paradigm of Western psychology than Buddhist psychology. That is to say, Western psychology, this view of the self is very important. And it's important for the self to get certain things through its stages of development. It needs to get adequate love and care. It needs to get adequate definition of the world and so forth. Whereas Buddhist psychology, and now with self-compassion, the idea is that if you give yourself compassion, the receiving of that compassion from yourself will help with the healing and the growth. When in fact, I suspect it's more the giving of the compassion that is healing to oneself. See, as with loving kindness, it doesn't matter so much who it's directed to. You're not sending vibes out that are going to heal that person. What you're doing is clarifying your own mind so that all these helpful factors are coming up moment after moment and not the unhelpful ones. So in a sense, and this is where it gets complicated with Buddhist ideas of self and non-self, in a sense, you kind of have to have a view of yourself as a wounded person in order to develop self-compassion. Whereas ultimately the Buddhists are saying it's more helpful to not conceive yourself as such a person, but to recognize that it's all impersonal process that's going on. Anyway, wrapping up here. Basically, what the Buddhist path is all about is wisdom. Wisdom doesn't naturally come up with mindfulness, just as mindfulness doesn't naturally come up with concentration or deliberate intention, just as deliberate intention doesn't naturally come up with awareness. These things are all building upon one another. But when you're able to observe your experience with true equanimity, with true mindfulness, that is empirically able to see it as it is, like an umpire in a game or like a judge in a courtroom, or like a scientist in a laboratory. You're simply observing without your own personal, selfish, subjective entanglement in what's happening. And when you see things that way, you begin to, at a very deep level, appreciate just how changing and impermanent it all is, how interdependent it all is with everything else within and out, without in your mind and in the environment, and how fundamentally this isn't about a self trying to get what it needs or wants. I mean, that's what gets us into trouble, the needing and the wanting. But the non-attachment, the being with things without clinging to them, is what leads to the qualities of mind that are then transformative. And wisdom ultimately works to diminish these unhealthy states. Over a lifetime of practice, these states are going to erupt into experience less and less often, with less and less intensity, and with less and less duration. And gradually, all of these sort of unhelpful red states are going to turn into all these healthy and helpful blue states. Nothing political here. I'm not making a political statement. This is just straight psychology. Okay, so that's what I have for you this afternoon. I want to allow some time for comments and for questions and for all the rest of it. But that's kind of a single map of the mind, if you will, as understood by this sort of classical Buddhist thinking that comes out mostly from the Buddha's lifetime, around the 5th century BCE, but it's elaborated by 3 or 4 generations after that as well. But all of this was firmly in place by the, call it the 2nd century BCE.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a fantastic, fantastic talk. Let's give Andrew a big round of applause. Okay, I have a hand held mic, and if you have a question, I'll just hold it up to your mouth. And anybody have a question for Andrew? Trabell.
I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on the section there of karmic and genetic influences and how what we do in our lives impact, the things that come back to us in our own lives.
Yeah, a great question. I mean, karma is a word that, like so many other words, like nirvana and yoga and everything, have been consistently misunderstood in our modern culture. Karma at its heart just means action. It has what you do, what you say, and what you think, the activities of mind and body. And the Buddhists are recognizing, and others, that what we do, our actions, are embedded in a whole matrix of cause and effect. And again, this is very empirical, very scientific. Everything in the natural world, even if you see them as billiard balls bouncing into each other, every motion has an effect on things around us. The Buddhists are simply sort of extending that to our psychological life as well. And again, just to take a simple example, if we're angry, if we have a state of mind that's angry and we say and act that out, we're learning to become a more angry person. By the same token, though, if we're kind, if we're generous, if we're thoughtful, if we're polite, and we act on that, everything we do, we learn, we cultivate that quality of mind that makes us more naturally and more spontaneously kind and helpful and polite and so forth. So what this means is our human character, our self, what we would call the self. Again, it's not that it doesn't exist, it's that it's fundamentally malleable. Our self is something that is constantly being shaped by our actions. So karma is viewed as our greatest ally, you know? On the one hand, it can feel like, well, I've inherited all this really negative stuff from the past. But that may be true. And you can say, I'm a victim of my past circumstance. I'm a victim of my, childhood, of my previous relationship, whatever. But the promise of karma is that you can deliberately do things in the present moment that will shape what happens next. Every moment, there's kind of a stimulus comes in, and there's kind of your perception and feeling tone around it. But then there's a moment of action where you can choose either a healthier or an unhealthier action. And, there are many simple examples of this in the modern world. You're driving on the highway and somebody cuts you off in traffic, It's up to you how you respond, if you have the conscious will to be aware of what's happening and to act intentionally. If you're just on automatic pilot and you're in a bad mood and you're in a hurry, you're going to swear at that guy or give him the finger or whatever without even thinking about it. It's a habitual response. But if you realize, okay, that person just cut me off, I can grind my teeth over that person and swear at them under my breath for the next 5 minutes or not. What's healthier for me? What if I spend the next 5 minutes thinking thoughts of loving kindness for that person? I'm so sorry for that person. They're probably in a rush because, some catastrophe. They're trying to be a hero. They're saving somebody in need. Or maybe they're just a jerk. Then you feel compassion for the fact that they're a jerk. But the point is, how are you using your mind for that 5 minutes? Are you using it in a way that hurts yourself, which anger and hatred do? They hurt ourselves because they train us to be a more and more unhealthy person. Or are we using our mind in that moment to improve ourselves, to become a better person, to cultivate those aspects of ourselves that we're most proud of, that we're most want to honor? Now, the genetic stuff I just put in there because, there's some genetics is one of the few ways that we can think intergenerationally. There's a lot of new material these days on sort of generational karma or generational trauma, for example. I'm not quite sure what to think about that, what the scientific basis of it all is. But it's also just the fact that people come into this world with different genetic fortunes, all the way from physical disabilities of some sort, being born blind or lame or whatever. But also there could be all kinds of genetic influences on how the mind develops naturally, before you get to an age where you can really intervene deliberately on the kind of person you choose to make yourself to be. Before then, there may be lots of ways in which not only your family environment is going to shape who you are, but maybe there are some genetic influences as well. Does that address what you're asking?
Yeah, that was fantastic. Any other questions? One more question from, yeah, hold on a second. Great. Isabella. Okay, no, what? I'll say it. I'll repeat it. Okay. Okay, so the question is, where does truth factor in this psychological map? Factor in truth. Where would you bring it in? With wisdom? How would you talk about truth?
Well, truth is a funny word, and the Buddhists use it in a way that's a little different from what we're used to. We're used to thinking of truth as something you spell with a capital T. There is a way the world is, and it's true, and everything else is mistaken or even false. The Buddhists use this phrase, seeing things as they really are, yatha bhuta, seeing things as they actually are. That doesn't mean that there's one and only truth. That means that in any given moment, there's a whole constellation of changes and specific things, and being able to see without the interference of your biases, of your projections, of your predilections. The Buddhists speak about truth as a way of kind of getting your misconceptions out of the way. And the more you can open to things as they are, the closer you're getting to seeing the actuality of things. But in this system of everything changing, everything being subjectively constructed, There is no objective truth. That's one of the ways Buddhism is becoming so compatible in the postmodern worldview, where there isn't one objective reality. Every person constructs their own reality. And collectively, every group, every culture, every, civilization constructs its reality in certain isomorphic ways, But there is no sort of truth other than a very clear ability to discern what's actually occurring. Now, the place wisdom comes in is because wisdom helps train you to see things as they actually are, or as they really are. And fundamentally, that means three things. I would add a fourth. Fundamentally, it means interdependence, change. Oh, sorry, not impermanence, change. Seeing that everything is always changing. There are no two moments in reality, physical or mental, that are ever exactly the same. Every single thing in the universe is changing all the time. Recognizing that and seeing it for yourself experientially in a very fundamental way is foundational to aligning your view of the world to the way that it actually is. And a lot of our confusion as human beings come with trying to project a kind of stability onto a fundamentally shifting world. The second thing is unsatisfactoriness, instability. Because it's all changing, we cannot expect it to be deeply satisfying. It's not okay. The first noble truth, the dukkha, is that there is suffering. And that doesn't mean everything sucks. That simply means that because everything is fundamentally changing, there is no way to get a sort of lasting satisfaction out of the nature of the world. Even if physically you're experiencing pleasure instead of pain, even if mentally you're experiencing pleasure instead of pain, you're happy. Even if emotionally you have pleasure and not pain, you have mindfulness and loving kindness and so forth. Still, existentially, you're going to suffer, recognize suffering, because fundamentally we're all going to die. We're all going to get sick. We're all going to get old. That's the truth, if you will. That's the way of seeing things as they actually are. And to the extent to which we fight against that or resist that, we suffer. To the extent to which we're able to adapt to that, we can experience pain without necessarily feeling deep suffering in the process. The third thing that they see wisdom fundamentally recognizes is just this notion of non-self. It's just that just as the elements of the universe come together in different combinations to form different substances, and none of it's personal. The same thing with the human mind and body. Again, we're a natural part of the natural world. When certain atmospheric conditions come together, pressure and humidity and temperature and so forth, we might get a big storm. We might give it a name like Katrina, but it's really just impersonal elements combining in a certain complex way, which when the conditions change will fall apart. And human beings are the same way. We are complex interactions of mind and body, and which we map out like this and in other ways. And fundamentally, there is no soul or self that is outside of those conditions. We are part of the natural world, and as such, we are impermanent. We are not going to escape old age, illness, and death. And we don't have to be defining ourselves as a self in order to thrive in the world. And the fourth thing I would add is just interdependence, just recognizing how everything depends on everything else. That doesn't mean it's all one. That means that in any given situation, there are a bunch of really close factors, farther factors, and distant factors that are all helping shaping why things are just the way they are.